Welcome to Broadway Drumming 101. My guest today is the legendary Cubby O'Brien. How are you today?
I'm good. I didn't know I was a legend though, but anyway.
You are a living legend. I'm so glad we connected. And, the funny thing is, sometimes you make very chance encounters with people. And I was performing for the second Broadway cruise that was out in March. And I was on the elevator with my girlfriend, and some people came on the elevator, and this a young man that you see on the screen right now turned to me and said, "Are you a drummer?" I said, "Yes." And he said, "Hi, my name is Cubby O'Brien." I'm like, "Cubby O'Brien? Really?" And that's how we met. And
Well,
we hung out for a couple of days, and we talked. We didn't really talk drumming. We talked more about sports because he's a Cowboys fan, correct?
yeah, and a Kansas City fan.
Ah,
You
you
know,
must
I
be
really,
a happy camper that they're very, very consistent team.
yeah, they are.
So do you think that would you have rather have Patrick Mahomes rather than Dak Prescott?
Yeah, I guess so. He reminds me of Tony Romo, though, in a way. They just can't quite get over the hump.
They're like this close to the end zone, and they
Yeah.
just
And last year they had a great team. They had a great year, and they get well, at their own stadium, they lose the first playoff game. It just doesn't make sense.
what do you think the solution is?
I don't know. They
Mm,
they seem to have good players. I'm a Dodger fan too, and it's the same thing with them. They wipe everybody out. They win 115 games a year, and then they lose in the first round of the playoffs.
mm.
It's just weird.
Weren't the Dodgers good in the '80s with Tommy
Yeah,
Lasorda and all those
yeah.
guys?
That's when I kind of grew up with them. I was a Dodger fan when I was younger too, with Maury Wills and Walt Alston was the manager, and
Mm.
when they first came out from New York,
Oh,
from
that's
Brooklyn.
right.
Yeah, they played at the Coliseum. I used to go watch them at the Coliseum
Mm.
before Dodger Stadium was built. That was 57, 56, 57.
That's when the stadium was built, or the
That's when they came out.
oh wow, that's right.
Yeah.
We could talk sports, but we're not here to talk sports.
All right.
Even though we could go on for an
Well,
hour
Broadway
talking
is
about.
kind of a sport too.
So tell me about the 50s. Let's go back to the 50s. I understand you were influenced by your father. He was a drummer.
Right.
And did you take lessons from him?
Yeah, I
Did you?
did. My dad was a big band drummer in New York in the 30s, played a lot of swing bands, and then he moved out to California with my two brothers. They were 10 and 11 years older than me. And they moved out in 1945, and I was born in 1946 in California. But he started teaching me when I was about 5 years old. He was a drummer, and by the time I was five, my brothers were 15, 16 years old, and one of them was a drummer. The other one played trumpet. So there was music in our house all the time, and I was banging on everything. So my dad said, well, maybe we should have a drum lesson. So he would go get me across. I went to a school across the street, and he would come and get me at lunchtime, walk across the street. My mom would have lunch for me. I'd have some lunch, and my dad give me a half-hour drum lesson, and we go back to school. So that happened every single day, 5 days a week.
When I was younger, I remember starting out on a practice pad, and the pad was like tilted to the left for a lot of people
Yeah,
that played traditional. Did you start out the same way on a practice
yeah,
pad?
yeah. I did absolutely. But I also always had drum sets in the garage. And at the time, I had a hi-fi out there, and I used to put Count Basie records on and Duke Ellington records on, and I would play along with them with Sonny Payne. I'd play all his same licks, and it was a lot of fun. And then I'd
Did
have drum lessons, and then I'd play for a couple hours on a drum set. So it was fun.
was your, after a while, did you think that, what, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life?
Never had any other aspirations. And then when the Mickey Mouse Club came along, it really solidified everything. I knew that's what I wanted to do. And so the Mickey Mouse Club was 55 to 57, 58. And then I went right to the Lawrence Welk show and did a bunch of things on the Lawrence Welk show. Tap dance, sang. The Lennon sisters were on, and Janet and I were about the same age. So they put us together to do vocals together and stuff like that. So show business was the only way for me, I guess, you know.
So how'd you get selected to be part of the Mickey Mouse Club?
Well, my dad was teaching at this music school in Sun Valley, California, and they put together this little band, this little Dixieland band of some of the kids at the school that were learning how to play their instruments pretty well. And we would do little shows around Hollywood and around like the Rotary Club or just anything free where we would just go to play. And so one of these shows was at the Screen Actors Guild at Christmas time. They were raising money for underprivileged children, and we played. And I was doing drum solos and had double bass drums and flipping the sticks and all that kind of stuff. And there were a couple of producers there from Disney Studios, and they invited us down to audition for this new show they were going to do on ABC. So I auditioned twice and got the show.
I was looking at some footage of you online with double bass drums. Now, I think Louis Bellson was one of the first people to play double bass
I,
drum.
I mean, he was a big influence on me, you know, and I took lessons from him for a while. And
Oh, wow.
he was a Murray Spivak guy too. I don't know if you know that name or not, but he was kind of a famous drum teacher in LA. And he had that finger control thing going. That was one of the things that he was teaching. And Louis was really into that too. So, but I took lessons from him, and we were kind of friendly, and it was a lot of fun. He was a great player. I loved him. And of course, Buddy Rich was also another one who influenced me. And Steve Gadd was on the Mickey Mouse Club, and he tap danced and I played drums. And then he drummed and I tap danced. So Steve and I have kind of stayed friendly through the years too. So it's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, that's another thing I was going to bring up. I saw some footage of you. Steve Gadd was playing, then you came over and they say, "Hey, Steve." I was like, "Wait, that's Steve Gadd." Did you see that, you know, I guess kids your age, did you see something special in him that he was going to be the Steve Gadd that we know today, or
Well, I did not really. I mean,
we just kids like hanging out, playing together, just having fun?
exactly. Yeah. I don't think
So
either. You don't know when you're a kid whether you're going to be good or not. I didn't do what Steve did. He went to Berkeley and really learned how to play that way, but I learned how to play by playing. I was working in Las Vegas with Spike Jones Band when I was 16 years old. So it was more on the job training for me.
so you went from the Mickey Mouse Club to Lawrence Welk to
Yep.
Spike Jones.
Spike Jones.
One of the things that I wanted to bring up is the evolution of music from the 50s to obviously today.
Mhm.
When you are, you know, growing up listening to, big band stuff and Louis Bellson and Duke Ellington and Count Basie, and then you're playing in the Mickey Mouse Club and you're playing with Lawrence Welk and different people. Then the 60s comes,
Right.
and this is your generation, and then the Beatles come. Were you watching like most other people when the Beatles were on the Ed Sullivan show?
Absolutely. My
Eh,
parents used to let me stay up and watch the Ed Sullivan Show because people like Louis Armstrong and Ella Fitzgerald would be on, or some comic that I really liked, or there were a lot of musicians and Elvis, and it was an amazing time to, and that did transition me. I bought Elvis records and I would play along to those too, and yeah, I mean, you could definitely see the gospel music and R&B was influencing the rock and roll and starting a new generation of music.
Were you heavily influenced by that particular event and the Beatles as well?
You know, my career has always been kind of showbiz, leaning toward showbiz. Probably because I was a singer and a dancer myself, and I know that side of how it comes about. So I've always been as versatile as I can be. And doing it in, in the 60s and 70s, I did a lot of studio work in Los Angeles because everybody had a variety show. I mean, Andy Williams and Dean Martin and Sonny and Cher and Carol Burnett and Jim Neighbors. Everybody had a variety show, and there were dancers and choreographers and singers and guests, and it was like entertainment. It was an entertaining. I've always wanted to be an entertaining drummer, somebody that can do a lot of different things. And that's one of the reasons that I've never really, as much as I enjoy jazz, I think you have to be dedicated to that particular genre to really be great at it. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
You know, but so I've always kind of prided myself in the fact that I can do a lot of different styles, and I enjoy all of them. I enjoyed my time doing Broadway. I enjoyed my time with Bernadette, the Carpenters. I spent 8 years with them. I enjoy playing different kind of styles of music.
When I talk to a lot of drummers that have played shows that have been successful, like yourself, one of the themes that runs through all of them is the ability to play different styles and having the experience of playing a wide variety of music, which is something that you had to do playing variety shows. You were, somebody would come on, you had to play whatever, would fit
Absolutely.
that particular artist.
Absolutely.
A lot of people today want to go to music school and then go right to Broadway instead of getting out and having the experiences that you've had. If you were to recommend to someone that wants to play shows or do kind of things that you've done, since you didn't go to, I guess you didn't go to music school, your music school was like real life.
Right.
Would you recommend people do more playing in real situations like yourself in order to get the experience? Would you recommend somebody going to music school or both? Or like, do you have any advice
I
to young
think
people?
I think either way. I mean, I think if you go to music school or Berkeley or one of those places, it's a great place to learn how to play. But then I have a friend who went that route, but now he's decided that he wants to be a professor and a music teacher. So you have to decide, do you want to play? Do you want to be a musician or do you want to be a teacher? Do you really want to spend it and have this kind of a life, Broadway? There's hundreds and hundreds of great drummers in New York City. It's not easy to get a Broadway show. So I really do think you need to be qualified. And one of the things that really helped me was working with a lot of dancers and choreographers and people like that, learning how to deal with those people and the way they think and the way they count and the way they feel about music. And I think the only way you can learn that is to do it.
What was the first Broadway show that you did? You did tours first, or did you do something in New York
No,
first?
the first Broadway show I did was Hair when I was the musical director for Hair in 1969.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And at the Aquarius Theater.
Oh, really?
And I was doing the Carol Burnett show during the day. I was doing the rehearsals and then in the evening I'd drive over to the Aquarius Theater and do Hair. Ben Vereen was in the show. Nobody even knew who he
Yeah.
was at the time. So
Wow.
yeah. So I had the band for that for over a year. And then Old Calcutta came into town and I did that show too. So those were the two first kind of, I guess Old Calcutta was more of an off-Broadway show, but Hair was a bona fide Broadway show. And a lot of great stars. Jennifer Warren came out of it. It was an amazing show.
So you were the music director. Did you get your experience as MDing from working with people on these variety shows? Like, how did that whole music direction thing come about?
Yeah, I think it did. Working with directors and choreographers and musical directors and conductors and yeah, you kind of learn. Bernadette asked me when her musical director recently retired and she got a new guy and he couldn't make the first rehearsal and she asked me if I could conduct the first rehearsal and I said, sure, I'll do it. I don't have great experience in conducting, but I know how to do it. And I did the rehearsal and we got through it. And then the next day, the real guy showed up and we did the show that night. So the more things you do and learn how to do, the better it is, you know?
You started working for the Carpenters in the early 70s, all the way up until the early 80s when Karen Carpenter passed away.
Right.
How did you go about getting that particular gig, and what was it like working with another great drummer?
Well, I was doing the Carol Burnett show. I was the drummer on the Carol Burnett show, and the Carpenters were guests. Yeah, this was 1972, 73-ish, right in there. And their manager came up to me at rehearsal and said, we want to get Karen away from the drums. We want to get her out in front. Would you want to go on tour with us? Carol Burnett show was going on hiatus for the summer. And he said, do you want to go on the summer tour with them? And because we want Karen out in front. So for a couple of weeks, I walked around with a headset on, learning that show because they didn't have anything written down, anything written down. So I had to learn their hits and all that. And Richard wanted every drum lick to be exactly that was on the recording. So if Hal Blaine went ba-da-doom, da-da-doom, dee-dee-doo-doo-doo-doom, crash, crash, that's what I had to do, you know? And Karen had to do it too. So for the first year or so, we played in tandem. We both played exactly the same thing. And then she a little bit more would get out in front, a little bit more. And then the second year, it was pretty much my job to be the drummer for the Carpenters. And she would play occasionally, or we'd do a big drum number together. But they finally got her out in front, and Bob Mackie started making gowns for her, and she started really liking it that she was out in front. At the very first, she didn't want it. She loved playing and she felt safe being behind the microphone and behind the drums. But once she got used to being out in front, she really liked it. So, and I had a great relationship with her. I really liked her and we got along really good.
In the 60s, there were certain types of drums. In the 70s, there were a lot more drums. There were, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, all the way.
I had all of them. Yeah. I had a 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, all the way around. All the way around. Yeah.
Did you like playing all those drums, and did you have to carry those from place to place?
No, I had a drum tech. He set everything up. And he loved the fact that he could set it up and I wouldn't have to move anything. He measured everything, how far the hi-hat was from the seat. Everything was.
Really?
I didn't even have to walk out on stage before I sat down at the drums. So, because
That's
we were
great.
doing a lot of one-nighters and theaters and around and stuff. We would just walk out there and everything was there. It was ready to go.
During the transition from the 24 and 26-inch bass drums, they probably had that in the 70s too. I can't remember.
Yeah.
And having all those drums, and even going from double-headed drums to concert toms, and eventually getting into electric. I just want to just ask you about the transition from the 60s, even from the 50s to the 60s to the 70s to the 80s. When the drum machine came about and
Yeah.
electronic drums, did you integrate that into your drum set in the early 80s or mid 80s? Or was that
A
not a
little.
something?
No, I did a little bit, but I never really cared for it that much, to tell you the
Hmm.
truth.
You didn't
But
like the sounds?
yeah, I mean, I did use it. I used it with Andy Williams and I used it with a little bit with the Carpenters. It was just barely coming in. One of the technicians came up with something, and so I used it a little bit, but not a lot. But I did use it. I worked with Siegfried and Roy, the magicians. I helped put together their show for the Mirage, and then we went to Tokyo, and they did 6 months over there. I went over to Tokyo to get that show going and started for a couple weeks, and they did use some electronic drums on that stuff. And so, yeah, I have used it, but I don't use it anymore. And I think it's kind of come and gone a little bit. It's not as prevalent as it For a while, everybody was using it. Every record had that sound on it, that boom, 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 boom sound. And nope, it's not around anymore.
Do you have, speaking of stuff being around anymore, do you still have any of those drum sets from the 50s or 60s?
No, I wish I did. I don't. I wish I had my plaid double bass drum set from the 1955, at the Mickey Mouse Club. It was
Mm,
a Ludwig plaid drum set.
mm. Do you still have your Mickey Mouse ears?
No, those are in the archives somewhere.
Mm,
We would get fined $50 if we lost our ears when
really?
when we were filming the show. And in 1955, $50 was quite a bit of money. So nobody lost their ears.
Like you'd put them in a secure location, like do not touch these ears.
Exactly, exactly.
So in the 80s,
Yeah.
were you back in New York? Okay, I know you lived in Los
No,
Angeles.
I was in LA. The 80s, after Karen passed away, I had been working with Bernadette Peters too during the time I was with the Carpenters. Even though I was on salary with them every week, we got paid every week, whether we worked or not. If we were off while they were recording or something, and we were off for a few months or something, I used to call Richard and say, Bernadette's going to Lake Tahoe for a week. Can I go up there? And he'd say, sure, go do it, whatever you want to do. But in the 80s, I worked with Joel Gray, Bernadette, Andy Williams, Juliet Prowse, and Debbie Reynolds. And I went to Vegas all the time. I was there all the time. And Atlantic City.
Mm.
Mostly those two places, I was working a lot.
So one of the reasons why we connected is because you're working with Bernadette Peters on the Broadway cruise.
Right.
How did you meet Bernadette? And it's been such a long, fruitful relationship that goes back decades.
Carol show.
Oh,
She
really?
she was a guest, and Carol loved having her on. She was on a couple of times a season. She was great in the sketches, and she sang great, and she looked great, and we just hooked up. I mean, her manager knew who I was from the Mickey Mouse, and Bernadette knew who I was. We're close to the same age, and Bernadette used to watch the Mickey Mouse Club. And it's funny, about 10 years ago, we were at a restaurant after Bernadette's show. We were all having dinner together or something, and somebody came over to get an autograph from Bernadette, and then they said, "Oh, Cubby, could I get your autograph too? Because you were my favorite Mouseketeer." And so I signed this thing for this girl, and Bernadette turned to me and said, "You know what? You were my favorite Mouseketeer too." So we have known each other since probably 1969 or 68, somewhere in there.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's incredible.
So
And
like I
she,
said, we worked during the 70s off and on because I was with the Carpenters. But when Karen passed away, I really started working with her. And in those days, we were doing Fairmont hotels like in Dallas and San Francisco and smaller venues like that. And then she just kept getting bigger and bigger and doing Broadway. So now we do mostly theaters and symphony orchestras and stuff like that. But we have an interesting thing. We do trios, we do an 11-piece band, we do a 30-piece band, and we do symphonies. So it's kind of different. I like doing the trios. It's a lot of fun,
yeah, and that's what I saw you with on the
on
ship.
the ship. Yeah.
That's great. And she brings you along whenever she has a show. She's like, I want this person to be my drummer.
I've pretty much done everything she's done, except some Broadway shows that she's done where I wasn't involved, like Into the Woods and Song and Dance and Sunday in the Park with George. For those 5 or 6 years, I didn't work with her, but I hooked up with Shirley MacLaine, and I went all over the world for 5 years with Shirley MacLaine in 1990, from
Mm.
1990 to 1995. She put together a self-contained band, 10-piece band, and we traveled all over the world. And then Bernadette was done, And Shirley was done, and I went to New York and did Annie Get Your Gun with Bernadette in 1998, 97, 99, 98.
So that's where I was going to get to next. Annie Get Your Gun, Gypsy, and the producers. Annie
Yeah.
Get Your Gun. I haven't seen that or Gypsy or the producers yet
Oh,
because
really?
I got to New York in 1993. I wasn't, Broadway wasn't really on my radar,
Yeah.
but now, I should go back and watch some of those. But I know that Gypsy's coming back with Audra McDonald. You originated book in the show. How much of the show was your input, and did you do more of the book writing of the drum part, or were you just playing what somebody was giving you?
Well, they were all new orchestrations. So the rehearsal period was pretty, like usual, 5, 6 weeks. And I had a lot of sketching to do and a lot of things to do, which was one of the things that I learned when I was doing Carol Burnett and other shows, other variety shows, is how to sketch and do drum parts and how to mark accents where the kicks are and where this has to go. And so that's one of the things that I knew how to do when I got to New York. So any drum part, I think you have the ability to make it your own. The drum, there was a drummer in LA, a really good drummer too, Jack Sperling. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. But anyway, he used to say the drum part is just a guide. And I said, well, how do you learn how to read all this stuff, Jack? I mean, he said, well, look, eighth note with a dot. He said, there's only so many ways that you can divide up one bar of music. There's only so many ways. So you learn what those are, and reading music becomes easy. So I learned how to sketch and write, and that really helped me when I got to New York. The first time I met Susan Stroman doing the producers, I met her and Patrick Brady up at Lincoln Center. They were doing something else up there, and the contractor said, I can't give you the job. You have to go up there and meet Susan because she's going to be the choreographer and the director. And so I went up to and I met her, and she was great to me. And I know she knew I was a Mouseketeer, and she knew some of the stuff I'd done. And I said, Susan, I guarantee you I know how to do this. That show was great for me because it was a blank piece of paper. It had never been done before. There was nothing when we first started rehearsing. It was Susan Stroman, myself, Glenn Kelly, the piano player, two dancers. And for 2 weeks, it was just us mapping out how these numbers were going to go, springtime for Hitler, and how Susan wanted it to look. It was very creative for me, and I love doing that kind of stuff. When I gave my sketches 9 weeks later, I gave my sketches to Doug Besterman, who did all the orchestrations. He took my sketches, and like they always do, they see the numbers, tape it. Then we go in our room and discuss everything. This should be brass here, and this should be this here, and that. I gave him my drum parts, and when I got the drum parts back from him, the ones that he orchestrated, he hadn't changed one thing. It was exactly the same thing I'd written.
Mm,
I wrote the drum parts for the producers, basically. He didn't change anything.
I understand the process of creating this show was funny because of Mel Brooks and how funny he was. Tell me about that whole process.
Hilarious, you know. And he started out as a drummer too,
Oh,
in
really?
the Catskills. Yeah. He was playing for comedians, he told me, and he would do all the shtick, boom, chick, boom, boom, and
Hmm.
all those comics and stuff that would. And one day he thought to himself, I can do what they're doing. I should go out in front and be funny. So he decided to be a comedian, and he gave up drumming. But we used to talk about drums, and but he was there every single day at rehearsal. And between Nathan Lane and Mel Brooks and Matthew Broderick, who had a very dry sense of humor, it was a pretty fun time.
So you were doing a bunch of different things over the years to doing the same thing the same way. pretty much every night. Did you find yourself in situation when you did shows?
Yeah.
How did you keep your mind fresh and your chops fresh when you had to play the same thing over and over again for the shows?
I always thought you can always do it better, number one. And what I always approach it like I want to do a perfect show. I enjoyed the challenge of playing the show. I memorized all the shows that I've done on Broadway, so I didn't have to look at the music. I could just focus directly on the conductor. I usually had a monitor so I could see what was going on stage with the dancers and stuff. And I didn't have to be glued to the music. I learned the shows as quick as I could. And but I had some advantage because I did the rehearsals too. So I had 6 or 8 weeks of rehearsal. So by the time we did previews and stuff, I pretty much had everything memorized.
Did you ever
Um, there's times when you feel like, wow, that was a special night. It's definitely a challenge to focus every single night. I see guys in the pit reading the paper, looking at different things during the scenes. They know they got 7 minutes of talk before they play the next thing. There's been a few times when the paper goes flying because they'd missed the entrance.
there are times where I've heard people falling asleep, but waking up right when the song is supposed to
I
start.
believe it. I believe it. Yeah.
When you had these shows, you had subs.
Yeah.
How did you go about picking your subs for your shows? What were you looking for?
I was looking for dependable, nice guys that were established in New York. Ray Marchico was one of them, and he's a great player. And, he's had his own Broadway shows. And luckily, he was available during some of those periods. He did Annie Get Your Gun and the producers. And Larry Lelly was another one who was just a great player. So, once they come in and learn the show and the musical director okays them, I could call them in the morning and say, can you go in tonight? And I didn't have to let anybody else know, so yeah, you want dependable people that are going to do a good job, because being a sub on a Broadway show in the drum chair is not easy. I never wanted to do it. The contractor said to me after we closed Gypsy, he said, well, start calling guys and sub on shows. I just didn't want to do it, because the first time I left the producers, did all the rehearsals. I did the previews. I did maybe 3 or 4 months of shows. And Patrick Brady finally said to me, you got to get a sub and you got to take some time off. You've been here for months. So I got Ray, and he was great. He came in and learned the show. And Patrick said to me afterward, he said, this was a hard show. He said it took Ray 2 or 3 or 4 times to get it the way I wanted it to be. And I said, well, it's not easy to do. So anyway, I came back, and the stage manager guy at the front door says, Nathan Lane wants to see you in the dressing room. And I'd never been to Nathan's dressing room. So I said, where's that? So you had to go upstairs, and I knocked on the door before the show. Nathan opened the door and looked at me, and he said, you can never leave again. And then he started laughing, and he said, no, it was fine. It was fine. After a couple of nights, it was fine. So it's a thankless job, because they get used to the way you play, and they get used to the sound of your drums, and they get used to, everybody plays a little bit different in the way they strike the drum. And it's a thankless job that I didn't want to deal with. Really.
I hear you loud and clear.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's really stressful, and it's a
Yeah.
lot of work.
Yeah.
So you left the producers
Yeah.
before the show closed, and Larry Lelly got the show.
Yeah.
What were you doing that made you say, you know what, I want to leave this secure job and do something else?
Well, Bernadette was going to do Gypsy, and Marvin Laird was going to be the conductor. I worked with Marvin for years and years and years in LA. We did television specials. The first time I met Marvin, I was doing hair. And Diana Ross and the Temptations were doing a special at NBC. And the staff drummer at NBC was a great drummer. I can't remember who he was at the time, but he was more of a jazz orientated guy. And I was doing hair, and they asked me if I would come over and do this show. So Marvin was the musical director for Diana Ross at the time, and I met him in 1969. Then he ended up doing Bernadette and was actually her conductor even before that. He started working with Bernadette when she was 16. So then I started working with her and Marvin is such a great guy. And I just couldn't pass up working with him and Bernadette. And Sam Mendes was going to be the director. So I made the decision to go over there, which was not easy. It was not, I spent many hours trying to figure out if I really wanted to do this, but I got to do it. It's Bernadette. I finally made the decision to leave. But I'm glad Larry got it. I called him and congratulated him on this getting a Broadway show. So
That's great. Yeah, Larry's great. He's
yeah,
producing now. He's doing all kind of great things now.
yeah.
What's the biggest difference to you between like live concerts and playing in a pit of a Broadway show?
Well, I love the live, the feeling of the audience being there and playing in front of people when they can really see you and hear you. I remember I was on the road doing West Side Story, and at rehearsals, the musical director was into all these, soft, got to be soft here, and then we're going to build, and we're going to. And I took off once, and I came back early, and I sat in the audience and listened to the way the guy was mixing the show, and I couldn't hear any of that. And I was wondering why aren't we hearing what the band really sounds like? And so playing live to me is the most fun of all, because you have audience feedback and anything can happen. It's when I was working with Shirley MacLaine, she'd turn the beat around sometimes and we'd all have to flip the beat over to the other side. And I mean, it was like Shirley used to say, performing live it's almost impossible to do a perfect show. The lights, the sound, the music, me, the dancers, somebody's going to screw up. Something's going to screw up. It's almost impossible to do a perfect show. But that's what makes it fun. It's the challenge to go out there and do the perfect show. And I must say, I've been with Bernadette for so long, and her musical director, like Marvin, before he left, but now we have some really good guys that come in. And Kevin Axe is our bass player. He's been with her for 10 years too. I don't remember ever coming off stage going, that wasn't too good, or that was a mediocre show. I think Bernadette always steps up to the plate. And so do we. That's what you got to do. No matter what's happening in your life, or you don't feel good, or there's things going on, when the downbeat starts, that's when you got to prove that you're a professional musician.
I'm 58 now. You're 27.
I'm going to be 78.
78. So you're 20 years older than me.
Right.
How do you maintain consistency? How have you done it for so long? I mean, you started in in the mid 50s and you're
Yeah.
still performing to this day. How do you maintain your longevity and how do you avoid drumming injuries for playing, for so many
Yeah.
years?
I haven't had any really. When I was with the Carpenters, we were on the road, and I was in a motel room or a hotel room, and I had one of those windows that's kind of spring down or something. Anyway, I caught my finger and right on the nail, and it blew up like huge. And we
Ugh.
had a show to do that night. So they took me to the emergency room. They drilled a hole in the nail to let the pressure off and wrapped it. And I played the show that night with my fingers sticking out, all wrapped up.
Ugh.
So that was one time, and another, outside of that, I've got a little bit of arthritis in this one thumb on my left hand that bothers me a little bit sometimes, but I don't pay any attention to it, you know. That's when I'm playing, it doesn't really bother me that much once it gets warmed up anyway.
Is it more about warming up properly and diet, exercise, mental health,
I
all of the
do a
above?
little, I do a little bit of warming up, but not a lot. I, I was never really a good practicer either. I didn't like to practice, you know. And in my own defense, I was working a lot. I mean, when I was 16, 17, 18, 19, I was with Ann Margaret and doing shows at night. And I figured if I'm playing 2 or 3, 4 hours a night, do I really have to practice during the day too? I mean, really? You know,
Right.
so I didn't do much. But I know there's other guys that would sit in their dressing room or their hotel room and practice 5 hours a day, but I was never really into it.
So how do you stay motivated to want to continue to play drums? Have you ever thought of, you know what, I'm tired of doing this. I want to do something else.
No, if I'm not going to ever do anything else.
Mm,
So the only thing that bothers me is the travel at this point, you know, getting places. Because I live in Eugene, Oregon. It's not easy to get to the East Coast. I have to stop somewhere, and it's most of the time it's a 12, 14-hour day getting from the West Coast to the East Coast and getting back. Because I have to fly to Denver, and then I've got a 3-hour layover and another 2.5-hour flight from Denver to Eugene. And by the time I get up in New York or someplace in my hotel room and get picked up, by the time I get home, it's 12, 14 hours later, you know. So it's not easy. That's the hard part. The the reason I do it is because I love playing and I love Bernadette. I love doing her stuff. And she's so loyal and loving and a great person that I've known most of my adult life. We were both
if
in our 20s when I met, and now we're both in our 70s. That's a long time.
if Bernadette said, you know, I have a new show, I want you to move to New York and be a part of it, would you say
I,
yes?
yeah, I would. Yeah,
Wow, that's
I would.
great.
At least for a year, you know. My
Okay.
wife and I talked about it if that ever came up. Yeah.
So you lived in Los Angeles, New York, and different places. You chose Eugene, Oregon. Now we talked briefly about places to move to because I eventually want to get out of New York City because it's stressing me out, and I want the longevity like you have. What was it about Eugene, Oregon that made you say, you know what, I want to live here?
Well, I had finished doing Chicago after Gypsy. I went on the road with Chicago for a year and a half. And I finished doing that or got tired of it. And we were in New York. And I had been there for 9 years, and my wife had been there for 5. And we just decided I started taking my musician's pension, and Social Security was coming up, and we had had enough of the Big Apple. So we decided to move to Washington. We were Washington State and built a house up in the mountains, and I started just working with Bernadette, whatever she was doing. And it worked out fine because she was doing what she's doing now, 1 or 2 shows a month, or, you know, we're going to London in August, and she's got 3 dates in August, and we're doing Carnegie Hall in October. So she does just enough for me at this point in my life, you know.
Somebody were to come up with to you and ask you, for advice on being a professional musician, what's one piece of advice that you'd give them?
I think whenever somebody asks you something to do something, like I remember working with Shirley MacLaine. When I got hired from Shirley from her choreographer director, Alan Johnson, and I had worked with Alan on the Academy Awards. I had done a couple of Academy Award shows, and he was a choreographer, and he did a number for Bernadette, an opening number. And Shirley would ask me to do things at rehearsal that I didn't think were musical or the way I would do it. I always said yes, just do it. Because the people that are asking you to do something, they think it's the right thing to do, and they're in a position to want it done that way. Just do it, and don't argue about it. Alan Johnson told me that Shirley fired so many drummers and sound people that it was ridiculous. And when I first met her at rehearsal in LA, she'd never met me, but Alan Johnson had told her about me, the Mickey Mouse Club, and that I could tap dance and sing a little. And she wanted to put a band together, not just players, but people that were entertainers. Like we had a great timpani player, and she was very flamboyant. And anyway, so he just said that she would fire people left and right, you know. And the first day she came up to me and she said, "Hi, I'm Shirley MacLaine," and stuck out her hand. And she said, "I've heard a lot about you." And I said, "Well, I'm Cubby O'Brien, and I've heard a lot about you too." And she started laughing, and we never had one bad day in 5 years.
Mm.
And I helped put her show together. Alan Johnson wanted me to do, we did a number called Clap Your Hands, which was a bunch of rhythm stuff. And I kind of helped do that number. And so she kind of relied on me to be like the go-between the dancers and the music. And so we became pretty good friends in 5 years. And I still see her occasionally. She's come to see Bernadette. You know, Bernadette's a friend of hers too. And she lives near Santa Fe in New Mexico. She just turned 90 and she's still making movies. She's working on a movie right now.
Wow.
So, yeah, one of the biggest thrills for me is after a show, like with a symphony or something, some cello player, some little girl cello player will come up to me and say, "God, it was so much fun watching you play. And what a thrill it was for us to work with you," or something like that. I just love it when a string player who usually hates drummers, number one, will come up and give you a compliment, you know? So it's always great to get compliments from people that are great in your same profession. Bernadette doesn't throw out compliments. She doesn't say, "Oh, what a great show you guys did tonight." So it's fun to get it from other musicians and other people, you know?
I'm somewhat of a historian, and I like to talk to people that were alive and experienced things long before I was, especially during pivotal parts of American history. This doesn't really have anything to do with American history, but has more to do with drums. I know a lot of people are so into vintage drums, and they're like, man, if I could just get my hands on this, 1967 Ludwig kit or Rogers kit or whatever.
Yeah.
And I see sometimes the people play them in pits, and I'm like, I think to myself, I'd rather have the latest thing because I feel that they sound better. Would
Yeah.
you, if you were going to do another show, if you could, would you rather have a 1957
No,
Ludwig kit or
no.
a 2024 brand new kit from some brand new, classic manufacturer?
I just want to give me a Yamaha drum set. I don't care. That's fine.
Oh, really?
Yeah. 2 snare drums, and I'll tune them the way I want them. And that's it.
So you wouldn't want a
You know,
classic drum set that you played on that back in the day?
I mean, Karen and I played on Ludwig stuff, and we had the see-through drums and,
Mm-hmm.
see-through this, and it was, it really doesn't matter to me because they always rent a Yamaha set for me, and I've got all the sizes that are on the specs. Everything is the size I want and everything. It takes me about 15 minutes to tune everything the way I want it to sound. But I hear it in my ear, the ding, ding, dong. I want them a certain way. Ding, dong, ding, ding, dong. Snare drum a certain way. That's it. 22-inch bass drum and some cymbals, and I'm ready to go.
You're like very easy to work with. Hey, just give him this and let's go.
Well, I mean, what are you going to do? There's been very few times where I've gotten a bad drum set. A couple of times when I was on the road with Andy Williams, we were in a couple of weird places and the drums show up and they're not too good, you know. So you just have to make do with what you get. Look at Buddy Rich. I mean, he used to go on the Tonight Show and play on Eddie Shaughnessy's double bass drum set and make it sound better than anybody could ever make it sound. He, he would just get up from the couch and walk over to the drums and start playing.
Yeah, he can make a table sound good.
Unbelievable. You know, I did work with him once. I met him a couple of times, and he was really nice to me. The first time I took Karen Carpenter to see Louis Bellson and Buddy Rich do one of their drum. They used to do these Battle of the Drums things.
Mm.
And Louis played his ass off as usual, and then Buddy came out and played his ass off as usual. I went back to see Louis first because I knew him, and he was soaking wet, and I introduced him to Karen. Then we went over to Buddy, who I'd met a couple of times. I said, Buddy, this is Karen Carpenter. And he went, Karen Carpenter? You're my favorite drummer. And so we're walking out, and Karen looked at me and she said, do you really think I'm his favorite drummer? I said, well, I don't know. That's what he said. So, the other time
great.
I was working at the Desert Inn Hotel in Vegas. I was with Suzanne Summers, and Buddy's band opened the show for a week. And I watched him every single night for a week. He was still playing great and playing 10-minute drum solos and sweating like crazy. And it was a thrill to watch him. And one night I walked past his dressing room and he was in there after the show, and he said, Cubby, come on in, man, come on. So I came in and we talked, and I had a chance to tell him that he was a big influence on me growing up and what a great player he was. And it was nice to talk to him one-on-one. So, but I know he could really be pretty difficult to deal with sometimes. Actually saw him. He had gotten a new Ludwig set, I think, and he was at Disneyland, and he was setting up his drums and he was playing them. And the Ludwig rep was there, and they got into an argument, and Buddy said, these drums sound like shit. And he picked up the snare drum and threw it off the stage and said, I'm not playing these.
What?
Yeah, it was pretty intense. But somehow they did do a show. For a while at Disneyland, they had big bands out there, and Betty was out there, and Count Basie was out there. And so I would go out and watch.
Do you have a top 5 list of your favorite drummers of all time?
Oh, goodness. Buddy and Louis, for sure. I love Grady Tate. Do you know his playing?
Buddy Williams told me about Grady Tate. He's like, man, Grady Tate, that brother. I was like, then I looked him up and I get
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, he was really good.
He can sing too.
And Welk is a phenomenal player, I think. I've seen some of his YouTube stuff. He's a great big band player, and and a teacher too, So, and I mean, I love the grooves that Steve Gadd gets. I mean, there's so many great players, That's why I feel so lucky my time in New York, because when I went there with Bernadette and she opened the door for me to get the producers and get some of those shows with all those great drummers in New York, I just feel really lucky.
Well, I feel really lucky that I got a chance to meet you in the elevator on the Broadway cruise.
Me too. Yeah. I think you were wearing something that said Zildjian on it. And I said, oh, yeah, well, you must be a drummer or something.
Well, I appreciate you taking your time out of your day, and I hope to maybe catch you on the next Broadway cruise if there is one in 2024, or maybe see you in New York when you're playing with Bernadette somewhere,
Yeah.
or when I move to Eugene, Oregon, we're going to hang out at a coffee shop.
That sounds like fun. Actually, we should do a brewery because there's a lot of breweries up here.
Ooh, really?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. All right.
I'm coming out there and I'm gonna give you a call. So
All
we'll
right.
we'll
Enjoy. I
connect.
enjoyed it. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you very much, and we will talk soon.
Bye.
All right, goodbye.